The Continental Army was encamped at a place called Valley Forge out in Pennsylvania somewhere. We didn't know whether Sam was there or not. From what we had heard, they were practically starving and hadn't any clothes. I was just as glad. It made me hope that the rebels were at the end of their rope and would have to give up pretty soon and end this terrible war. I didn't even mind that Sam might be suffering with cold and hunger. It would serve him right. We were pretty hungry ourselves. Sam began writing us letters every once in a while, 2 or 3 a month, especially after he heard that Father was dead. He didn't tell us where he was in his letters. Mostly they'd be about places he'd been. Sometimes Betsy Reed would get a letter from him, too, and she'd come to tell us about it. So time passed. And the year 1777 ended, and in 1778 began. Spring came, then summer and fall, and we harvested. Oh, how I hated the war. All of life was like running on a treadmill. I was 14. I should have been going to school all this while and learning something. Maybe by this time I would have begun to think about going to New Haven or to study at Yale. I wasn't much interested in Latin or Greek, but in the last couple of years I'd learned a lot about buying and selling in the tavern business, and I wanted to study calculating and surveying and agricultural sciences. I thought I might have a career in business. I might apprentice myself to a merchant in New Haven or New York or even London to learn the art of trade. Sam owed it to me to come home and help Mother run the tavern for a couple of years while I started to make my way in the world. But until the war ended, there was nothing for me to do but tread water. Prices kept on spiraling upward. Merchandise grew shorter and shorter in supply, and everybody seemed to be in debt. You couldn't refuse a hungry widow who'd lost her husband in the war, some cloth or molasses on credit, but then how could we pay for new merchandise ourselves? We couldn't get over to Verplank's Point that fall. The rebels were holding all the northern Westchester County, Peekskill, Verplank's compound, all of it. There was no way for us to get any cattle through. There wasn't much cattle around anyway, and bit by bit, people had been slaughtering their stock for food. However, Mother and I had been able to get a hold of 8 scrawny cows, mainly from people who owed us a lot of money. And there wasn't much to them, but with food in such short supply, I figured we could get a pretty good price for them if we could get them to a British commissary somewhere. Not that I cared which side we sold them to, but the British were the ones who had the money. They had the whole English exchequer behind them. The Continentals were paying off in commissary script, which could be totally worthless if they lost. I'd heard that there was a British commissary in White Plains, which was about 25 miles southwest across the New York state line. I figured I might be able to drive the cattle down there through the woods. It would be very risky, but better than going hungry. And we needed some money to buy goods and to keep the tavern and the store going. If the business died, we'd really be out of luck. Hunger is a pretty terrible thing. It's like going around all day with a nail in your shoe. You try to put it out of your mind, but you never really quite forget it. And when something reminds you of it, like reading about a big meal in a story or seeing a stack of bread, it really hurts. I mean, it just plain hurts. It makes you feel weak, and you get sick easily too. And that winter, everybody had colds and went around sniffling most of the time. Some people got really sick, and then their families would have to scrape up extra food to feed them with. Oh, I didn't mean people were dying from hunger. Nobody was really starving to death, but most were hungry all of the time. A lot through November, I tried to find out about the British commissary, whether it really existed or not, and where it actually was. But I couldn't find out anything I really trusted. It was all rumors, and the commissary was at White Plains. Ah, no, it wasn't at White Plains. It was at Horseneck. Ah, yes, it was at White Plains after all, but the rebels had it under siege, and so forth. I didn't want to go until I was sure, and if I ran to the rebels, I'd lose the cattle and probably be put in prison myself. It was only worth the risk if I knew sure where the commissary was. Otherwise, we might as well just eat the cattle ourselves. And so that was the situation on December 3rd, 1778, when Sam came back to Reading. That morning he walked into the tavern. He looked thin and tired. There were black circles under his eyes, and his uniform was torn in about 6 places. He had lost his belt and was wearing a piece of rope around his waist, and his hat wasn't an army hat, but just an ordinary fur cap. But he was glad to be home and grinning. "Hello, everybody," he said. Mother was out in the kitchen, and I'd been stoking up the fire. "Sam!" I shouted. "Mother, Sam's here!" And she burst into the tavern and began to hug him, and I hugged him too. And then he crouched down in front of the fire, and he ate a bowl of porridge with honey that Mother brought him. "This is the first time I've been warm for a week," he said. So we asked him all the natural questions, where he'd been and where he was going and so forth. "I'm going to be in Reading for a while," he said. "General Putnam is bringing a couple of regiments here for winter encampment, and we're going to Lonetown and hole up until the spring." "Well, what's the idea of that?" "Well, the rumor is that we're supposed to be situated to move either west to the Hudson or south to Long Island Sound in case of a British attack either place. Some say we're mainly here to watch over the magazines at Middletown. I don't know. Those are the rumors. But we're building huts, so I guess we'll be here for a while." "How'd you get off?" "I've had a bit of luck. Colonel Parsons, Samuel Holden Parsons, that is, has moved to Betts' house. An adjutant came around and asked if any of us were from this area, and I was, so Colonel Parsons brought me into town this morning to show him around." Sam grinned. "To the ladies, mostly. I told him that there weren't any ladies in Reading except my mother and my girl, and he said they would do. So, Mother, you'd better put on your best dress." Mother smiled, but I don't think she thought it was very funny. "You're so thin, Sam," she said. "Are the troops all starving?" "Everybody in the country is hungry. It's going to be worse this winter, too. Have you got any cattle, Tim?" I was proud that he asked me instead of Mother. 8, I said. "They are not much to look at, though. Butcher them and hide the meat, or sell it. You can get a good price for the hides from the troops. Sell what you can. I promise you the stock will be stolen." Mother frowned. "You mean your troops are stealing from your own people?" "A starving man will steal food from babies." He shook his head. "There's a lot you don't understand. All of us have even been seen good friends killed. I had a friend bayoneted, and it took him 6 hours to die, screaming all the while. All we could do was hold his hand and wait. I saw a captain I loved blown in half by a cannonball. He was the best officer we ever had. He worried about his men. He put them first. He never ate before we were fed, and I've seen him go without to give his portion to a sick man. The redcoats blew him in half, right into 2 pieces, with his guts dangling in both parts." He shivered. "After a few things like that, you don't give a darn for anybody but your friends anymore. You kill redcoats the way you butcher pigs. The troops know that Reading is a Tory town. As far as they're concerned, taking cattle from Tories is getting revenge. Sure, lots of them would steal from anybody, whether they were Tories or patriots or anything else. Some are scrupulous when they are hungry, and some are unscrupulous by nature, and they'll take whatever they think they can get away with. Of course, the majority of men are honest and won't steal, but if they decide you're Tories, they'll have no compunction about taking your beef. And let me tell you, it's pretty easy to decide somebody's a Tory when you haven't eaten anything but hardtack and pork fat for weeks. I've done it myself. Sam, I won't apologize. War turns men into animals, Mother said. I was ashamed of it afterwards, but not very, and my belly was full. He nodded slowly. Tim, butcher the cattle. Let the meat freeze and hide it in the loft under the hay until you need it. He glanced out the window toward the Betts house. I'd better go. Colonel Parsons may be waiting for me. Don't go yet, Sam, Mother said. We've just seen you. I'll be around all winter, Mother. Maybe I can get attached to Colonel Parsons' staff. I'll try to get a pass if I can. Anyway, I can always slip out at night. It's risky. Colonel Parsons is not harsh, but General Putnam is in charge. He's a great patriot, but he's rough and tough on men who shirk their duty. 100 lashes for desertion, and if there's too much of it, I know he'll hang some people as an example. And that's the kind of man he is. But I'll be back to visit again one way or another. He left. We walked out into the yard with him, and he crossed over to the Betts house, and he went in. He's so thin, Mother said. I worry that he'll get sick. I couldn't bear to lose another Tim. And all at once, she began to sob. It only lasted 10 seconds, and then she turned and went into the house, and when I went in a minute later, she was calmly scrubbing some beets. After December 3rd, we began to get used to the sight of soldiers constantly around town. There were always messengers going by in trains of supply wagons crunching over the snow, and sometimes groups of soldiers or work parties would appear at the tavern for beer. Having the troops around was good for business. Some of the officers lodged in houses around about. Often in the evening they came up to the tavern to play cards or to drink and smoke. Business was good. Or rather would have been good if we had had anything to sell, and people had had anything to pay for it with besides commissary scrip. The biggest demand was for liquor. Life at the encampment was cold and miserable, and the only relief for them was drinking. And they didn't care what it was, rum or whiskey, cider, anything we could get. Whiskey was pretty hard to get. The General Assembly had made it illegal to distill whiskey because it was made from grain, and grain was needed for food. Rum was easier to get, and we could usually get cider because every farmer made it. I spent a lot of time riding around among the farmers buying whatever they had. They'd often have rum they'd taken in trade for livestock. I could offer them good prices for liquor because we could get prices for it. Good prices for it. The officers didn't care how much they paid for liquor, and they said, when they were drinking, a short life, but a merry one, which of them knew when he was going to die. Of course, the ordinary soldiers didn't have much fun. For one thing, there was always the snow. It came down in a great blizzard about a week after the troops had started to build encampment. Their huts were not finished. Just tiny log cabins with big stone fireplaces making the whole rear wall. In cold weather, they had a lot of trouble getting the mortar to set. Because of this, the chimneys leaked so badly that half of the smoke blew back into the room. The snow made hewing wood difficult, too. Sam told us that they were having an awful time getting the huts finished. Even when they were done, there wasn't much to live in. 12 soldiers jammed into a 14 by 16 room, breathing more smoke than air and having to stumble over people whenever they wanted to move around. And the snow never stopped falling. By January, it covered the countryside 3 feet deep, so that the stone wall disappeared. You could drive a sleigh